From Minneapolis, Minnesota, welcome to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.
Welcome to Theater Begins Here, a podcast for our Playwright Center members. I am Hannah Joyce, Director of Membership Programs, and this is
Alayna, Jacqueline, Membership Programs Manager, and this team supports our 2,400 plus playwright members around the world. Well, without further ado, we can introduce our guest today, which I'm really excited about. Today, we have a special guest, Lynde Rosario, joining us to help demystify the role of dramaturgy and what it is to be a dramaturg and what it is and what it isn't. Lynde is a director of fellowship at Playwright Center and impact assessment director for National New Play Network. She's also a dramaturg and president of Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. Current and former affiliations include the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival, the Playwrights Realm, Working Theater Company, Curious Theater Company, Denver Center for the Performing Arts Theater Company, the Catamounts, Local Theater Company, Creed Repertory Theater, Athena Project, Letter of Marque Theater Company, and the Anthropologists. She holds a BA in drama from Hofstra University and an MFA in dramaturgy from the American Repertory Theater / Moscow Art Theater Institute for Advanced Theater Training at Harvard University. Thanks for joining us, and I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So we're going to jump in and ask you to describe your theatrical journey and how you found your way into dramaturgy, of all things.
Oh, sure. It seems like a very long journey. I have always been a lover of theater. I started as an audience member, as a very young audience member, seeing TYA shows with my family. Theater for Young Audiences is what TYA stands for. And from there, I sort of jumped in the acting pool with after school programs starting as early as elementary school and going all the way up through high school. So I was always sort of a drama theater kid growing up, and then knew by the end of high school that I would be pursuing a career in theater in some way. And so when I was accepted to Hofstra University, that was a really important moment for me to start exploring what avenue of theater I would be most suited for, because I really didn't know at that time. I felt like I knew I didn't want to be an actor. That was clear. But there were so many other opportunities to explore different disciplines of theater practice at Hofstra, because it was sort of a general BA in drama in a way that didn't necessarily dictate how you or prescribe how you traverse or navigate the different disciplines. You were really allowed to try everything. And what I learned by trying everything is that I'm much more suited to this world of dramaturgy. And it was really by process of elimination when I realized I wasn't going to be a stage manager or a designer or a technician in all of the ways that I was finding out firsthand, doing very hands-on type practice in my undergrad. And it was really a professor, Dr. James Kolb, who was my advisor, who said, actually, the things that you're interested in and are already doing around research and curation and theater literature and theater history, those all sort of live in this world of dramaturgy. And once it was named, I sort of took that and ran with it. Once I had a name for a career path, it was really exciting for me to see that at the time, and this may date myself a little bit, that there was sort of a path forward to a salaried career in this world. If I chose not to be a freelancer, which is just a different path entirely, no better or worse, I would say. But at the time, it was very clear that if I wanted a more secured position at a regional theater as a dramaturg, I would have to receive a master's level degree, which I did. and then pursue sort of a position in literary management, which was at the time the very clear way anyone were to achieve sort of a standard institutional position in the American theater. I'm happy to say that that has very much changed. Many institutions are now not requiring sort of these much more elite degrees and are leaning in more to experiential learning and the ways in which you have come to dramaturgy in the field as opposed to in the classroom. And so that's a new thing that I'm very excited to see. I would say at the time there was also very limited master's courses in dramaturgy, and so my options were rather limited, and I'm happy to say that that also has taken a beautiful shift to more abundance in dramaturgy programs in universities across the country. So, and then, yeah, once I had the degrees and I was out there in the world, believe it or not, I didn't get a job right out of grad school, like I'm sure many have experienced, but I did go into the freelancing world, working directly with playwrights and small theater companies who could afford to bring in a dramaturg for projects. But I did that enough where many small companies that I worked for did include me in a recurring series of projects. And so I got to develop some very substantial relationships with those theaters, small ensembles, and mostly in New York. I will just say that I'm from New York originally, and I was based in New York until about 6 years ago. So I'm only a new Midwesterner, if you will. I was originally from the East Coast, but I have never really deferred. Once I really set myself on a path to dramaturgy, though many dramaturgs employ sort of this hyphenate artist life where they are also a playwright or also a director, also many other things, I have really existed in a very singular way that way, where dramaturgy sort of encompasses my identity as an artist in a way that feels very fulfilling, but also very fluid. And that helps me sort of engage in a much wider practice than I believe I would if I were to compartmentalize my artistic identity through different disciplines, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I have a very big question to ask you.
Yes, please.
Which is, what is the role of a dramaturg?
I love this question. And yes, it is a big one because as I've just said, the role of the dramaturg can be very expansive, but also very fluid. A dramaturg very often will be seen as, and I'm going to use some terms that I disagree with because I will debunk them in a moment, the in-house critic. I will debunk this and say that I see my role as the in-house audience member. When I am reading a new play for the first time, I position myself as an audience member, seeing it in front of me as if it were the world premiere of that piece of work. In the same way that pieces of work that have had many productions, Shakespeare plays, for example, also require the role of a dramaturg to be very adaptable, to say, okay, this Shakespeare play, let's take Romeo and Juliet, for example, has been known throughout history for a very long time. So if I am coming to this role as dramaturg on this play, what are the requirements for this production? What are the things that the other members of the creative team need me to support them with? Because I see the role of the dramaturg as being a support role and not necessarily a generative role. And so one thing I say the role of dramaturg is often professional collaborator. We are meant to come into a process, not as a singular entity, but in a team of folks, creative teams specifically, to talk about the context of the play, the intentions of the playwright, be they known or speculated, depending on how alive or not these playwrights happen to be. And also giving a lot of the bridge building material, that interstitial tissue that links the text to the team, the creative team, but also the work and vision of that creative team to the audience members who will then receive it. Again, I find that the role of the dramaturg lives mostly in tandem with the role of the audience member. So you're not necessarily critiquing the work as you are processing it, but ultimately you are observing and responding organically in a way that feels like, well, if there's an intention that is not being executed to its fullest, it is your audience who will tell you that, oh, actually, I felt a different way when I heard that line or saw that moment in front of me. And if that's not how you intended me to feel as the creator of this work, let's talk about the different ways we can achieve that intention. That doesn't take away from the original vision of your work, but also makes it so that your audience is coming along with you. And I think even for a classic work, especially one that perhaps maybe is not as well known to an audience and may feel a little more obscure, I think it's really important for dramaturgs to create that context for not just the artists participating in the creative process, but the audience members who are ultimately receiving the product of that process.
So we've had this conversation before, Lynde, but I think about this larger question, which is that there are different moments when a dramaturg might interact with a script. They might interact with the script when it's still, in its early written form, or as you were just kind of alluding to, talking about a dramaturg in a space in the theater when all the collaborators are coming together to, put a piece on stage. Can you talk about how a dramaturg interacts with playwrights in these two different spaces?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So for me, if I am working with a playwright on an idea that has just been formed, right? The play has just been born of them and their idea and put on the page, I'm much more apt to go into a conversation or a one-on-one meeting with a playwright with a series of questions, curiosities, things that not only impressions about what struck me or what made me feel a certain emotion at a certain moment, but also understanding what the playwright's intentions are before I start offering my impressions is incredibly important to me, because it gets the playwright to start articulating things that I may have missed. And if I missed them in my very first reading of their new work, it's important for me to articulate that back, to say, oh, if that's a value of this piece or an element that is essential to your work, and it has been overlooked by me, the one who has received it blindly, right, from just reading it first off the page, it's exciting for me to start talking through, okay, what are the things in which we can do to adjust or achieve your intention with me, the audience member of your work? And how can we communicate your vision so that the next total stranger who picks this play up will ultimately have that same response you're hoping to have? And the creative teams, who will very likely take your play on without you in the room, how do you want to fully communicate your vision to them on the page so that when you're not there as the playwright, your work is still dictating how it is to be seen? And I think that's important to recognize that you, the playwright, have complete ownership over what your creative vision is. And I, the dramaturg, am there to support and help solidify that and help to make it shareable with other team members. Because again, as a collaborator, I'm not writing your play, no, and I'm certainly not revising your play, but I'm offering you my observations and ultimately an analysis of those observations, an interpretation, so that you can come back to your revision process with some concrete ideas of what may have been lost in translation from your idea to the page, or what may have been misinterpreted by a specific type of person. I cannot represent every audience member in the world. And so very often I will encourage a playwright not just to engage with one dramaturg, but to find multiple dramaturgs to read their work, because ultimately, A, you're extending your audience base, people who get excited about you and your writing, but B, you're also receiving different perspectives. And so, for example, I, as a woman of color of a certain age and education, will have a completely different perspective than someone who is of a completely different community, culture, and education level than I will. And maybe you're not writing for me. And if that's the case, and that's totally okay. And if that's the case, I will often recommend a series of dramaturgs, because of my vast network, after many years of engaging with them, to say, actually, I think there's a couple other folks who might be better suited for you. And it's important for me to be very honest, and all dramaturgs to be very honest when they feel they are not necessarily the appropriate dramaturg for that piece of work. And that doesn't always just happen in new plays. There are many classic plays that feel inappropriate to some folks with certain levels of expertise versus others. And I think that is just, again, speaks to the expansiveness of dramaturgy and how much like medicine, you can have specialists and different types of various types of doctors. All of them are accredited. All of them are well respected in their field, though not all of them do exactly the same thing. The podiatrist and the ear, nose, and throat doctor are not better or worse than one another, but they are very different and accomplish different things with you and your body. And so your body of work may also require different things and different people throughout your artistic journey, I believe.
So then for like newer playwrights, what advice would you give them of when they should reach out to a dramaturg, and then also choosing the right dramaturg for them?
Oh, that is such an important question. And I'm so glad that you asked that, because it is ultimately as important as someone who is trying to find a new primary care physician or a new therapist of any kind. And it really takes that level of patience with folks to understand not everyone will be right for me. And I don't know until I ask. Right? Until you start having consultations, you won't fully know who is the right person to interpret your work, who understands your process in a way that you feel comfortable sharing. And I'd say that ultimately that is the tell of when. If you are ready to share your work, if you are open to that level of vulnerability, especially if you don't know this person, and you are willing and able to share a piece of your personal art with them, that is the first step. Once you identify, I am ready to share this, it shouldn't just live with me, then I think it is important to start engaging outside eyes. I like to refer to myself as the outside eyes a lot, because I did not create the work. And very often I know very little about the playwright who shares it with me. And I am often introduced to this person, this human being, by the words they have shared with me on their page. And so I get to know a little bit about them and their aesthetic and their style and the way they write, their form, by just reading their work without ever meeting them. And then when I get to meet them, it's very exciting for me to start to learn, okay, what was the process for you in this? What are the lingering questions you still have about this work? Why did you choose to engage one person as opposed to having a reading with all your friends? Like what are the things you need from me so that I know how best to support you? There really isn't a one size fits all when it comes to dramaturgy, because there isn't a one way to write a play, and there's not one way to be a playwright. And so, and very much like the human body, we are all extreme individuals, though we tend to have somewhat of similar parts. And so when I use this, again, this metaphor of medicine, because very often a lot of the things we do are diagnostics. We're looking at something and going, oh, does this not feel just right for you? Okay, let's look at exactly what the mechanisms are that feel a little off and start to tweak and start to see what are the things that make it feel better, make it feel more shareable, something that you would feel very proud to have a world premiere of, and excited to invite other people to see your work. Because ultimately, theater is a shared experience, right? Like you can paint a painting and put it in your home and no one ever sees it, and that's still art. Theater is a collaborative art. And so it feels like once you start having those collaborative conversations, sharing not just the work itself, but ideas and interpretations of the work, if you're ready for that kind of engagement, it's time. And it doesn't have to be a full draft. And it doesn't have to be, like I get playwrights I know who send me a scene and say, I think this is an idea. I think it's something else. I don't know where to go with it, but I want to hear your thoughts. And that's something that's exciting, because then they're not necessarily engaging me in questions, but as a thought partner. And something that I find that a lot of dramaturgs, when they have longstanding relationships with playwrights or ensembles or theater companies, they'll start to reach out to them just for thought partnership in a way that feels like their collaboration, doesn't hold any authority or ownership over your work. Your words are still your words, but also sort of frees you up to step back and not live so deeply in the work itself, but to have a more subjective and objective conversation about like, why this play now? What are the things that feel important to you to say to the world about the world? And how can I support that vision moving forward? That is ultimately what I feel is the greatest benefit to new work, is when you can start fully breaking down, like, what are the needs, and start identifying what you need to move it forward, and then letting the folks around you support that.
I have encountered pushback against dramaturgs in the past. And my feeling is that this probably comes from misconceptions about what a dramaturg is or does. Can you speak to why you think those things happen? Like, are there things that are happening that shouldn't be happening that are giving us misconceptions about what a dramaturg is? And what is not the role of a dramaturg?
Absolutely. Yes. And I have also been a part of many of those misconceptions. And I find that a lot of folks, if they have had an experience with a dramaturg that perhaps did not go well, they will sort of write off the profession as, oh, I don't want this. I tried this once and I didn't like it. As many human beings will do if they become misdiagnosed by a medical professional, they will sort of be like, nope, I'm moving to holistic medicine. I don't want to be prescribed bad things. But I completely understand that fear. But also, I think it's important to recognize that one bad experience does not create a generalization for all. And also to say that some of the terminology can also be confusing. I tend to equate or a metaphor to medicine, but even that term script doctor is one that is used in a way that sometimes is problematic. I don't feel like my role is to fix your play. If you find that you've gotten feedback from a group to say, hey, your play has problematic moments, and you send it to me and go, fix those moments, I do not write the plays. And I will say that I don't work with plays, I work with playwrights. And it is the person that I'm working with and the artist that is creating the work that I am supporting. And I'm not here to take your script and rewrite it. That's your job as the playwright. However, I am also a resource. And so some things can be misconceived based on the type of resource you assume as a writer that I carry. I am of Puerto Rican descent, but I do not speak Spanish. And so if you send me your play and say, I need a translation, I'm so sorry, I cannot help you. And so there is just an unintentional misconception based on, oh, all dramaturgs do translations. Many dramaturgs do translations, but not all. And it's important to recognize that if you need some specialized skill or a specific type of conversation to engage in, choosing the right dramaturg for you is going to take a little bit of an extra lift. And it won't simply be whichever dramaturg is available, but very often I encourage even early career dramaturgs to be very clear about what are the skills you can offer, what are the ways in which you feel like you are a good fit for a process or not, and be honest about that. In the same way that I hope playwrights, when they come to me, they are honest about what their expectations are. For example, translations. If that's an expectation, please be clear. Honestly, I find that a lot of misconceptions come from a very antiquated view of dramaturgs, again, being a critic or being someone who is there to pick apart things that are not working. If anything, I find that I spend most of my time talking to playwrights about moments that excite me, moments in their play that really resonated with me, that felt meaningful and significant and felt like they spoke to larger concepts of the human condition and the human experience that I hadn't maybe thought of before reading their play. And really sharing with them not just my impressions, how they affected me personally, but how, again, I come to it as an educated in-house audience member, how I see their play in the larger canon of the American theater or history of global theater. There are many times where a playwright will be so excited that I'll say, oh, I noticed you named this character Cassandra. I know what you did there. Because in ancient theater, Cassandra is the truth teller. And so there is something to this pattern of history and trope that lives in our cultural DNA that finds its way back into plays that not everyone who didn't have sort of that larger education carries with them. But when they find that person who gets the Easter egg and finds the Easter egg and says, hey, I got it. I got that cute thing you did in that moment. It's incredibly meaningful to them. And I always encourage young dramaturgs to do that, to not look for the things that are wrong, but to really start to encourage and amplify the things that are really right with this work and how to move it forward, right? I don't think any dramaturg is coming to a new work going, never produce this, never show this to anyone ever again. That's just not what we do. If anything, we are nurturers of new work, and we want to see it grow to be its most successful and fullest, not just for the audiences, but for the writers themselves. Absolutely.
So this is also another big question, and you can categorize this however your brain wants to, because I feel like if I asked like 10 people this, they would find 90 million different categories. What are the different kinds of dramaturgs out there? Kinds of dramaturgs / type of dramaturgy.
Wow. And you're absolutely right to assume that you would get many different answers, because every dramaturg you ask that question to would probably have a long list, as I'm sure I will relate to you just now. So the different types of dramaturgs that I know in my world, all exhibit the same skill set. I will say that we all have a similar way we approach the work. However, our roles dictate that we proceed differently depending on where we are. So, for example, freelance dramaturgs, I'll start there. The people who just sort of go out into the world and read plays and show up in production rooms with their PowerPoint presentations and really dig into research and going to as far as making actor packets, program notes, the things that contextualize for audience members in production, but also in development. I will say that I identify as a new play dramaturg, so not exclusively, but primarily in my work. I know dramaturgs who identify only as academics. They live in the university world, and that is the world they are comfortable in, and they train the next generation of artists to understand how field work and practices are shifting in the American or global theater. There are opera dramaturgs, there are puppet dramaturgs, there are circus dramaturgs, there are dramaturgs who teach, like I said, but there are also dramaturgs who mentor. There are dramaturgs who only work on classic works, and there are dramaturgs who only work on new works. And there are dramaturgs who run retreat spaces, nurturing artists to really examine their creative process. But ultimately, because I'm sort of rambling off this long list, something that I have carried with me as a way to talk about dramaturgy to non-theater people, or theater people who might think like, I don't really understand this word you're using. I've tried really hard to start breaking down what I think those primary skills of all dramaturgs are. And for me, they live in three worlds: observation, analysis, and response. So this has nothing to do with people's taste. What they like and what they don't like in the theater world, is somewhat irrelevant to me, but how they take in information, right? Observe and really process what they're seeing so that an analysis or an interpretation of that information can be understood. And then what is the response? We can't just live with these thoughts in our head. We must communicate them and express them to the creative team, to the writer themselves, to the institutions we work for. And what are the ways in which we do that? So with that basic sort of three-part skill set, I apply dramaturgy to literally everything I do. I observe, analyze, and respond to my grocery list. I do it to my, the emails that I get from different corporations as I'm reading their narratives. We just passed Giving Tuesday around like why they think they are the most important person you should give all your money to. I am observing, analyzing, and ultimately responding or not to how I interpret these. And I think it's important to recognize that even though there is a vastness to dramaturgy, there is also a fluidity, and the way you employ observation, analysis, and response will have to adapt to the situations you find yourself in, be them academic situations, rehearsal room situations, one-on-one consultations with playwrights. I find it even when I talk to my own family members who are not theater people, I will just say that it's important to start engaging in those types of, I guess they wouldn't necessarily be soft skills, but skills that you can morph to whatever situation you need them to be in, and really start to understand that, the audience member in you is just there to respond and take in what you see and see things honestly, and not try to put your own biases or interpretations on top of something, but ultimately talk about how it affects you. And for example, you had mentioned I am the impact assessment director for the National New Play Network. Most people don't think impact assessment director when they think dramaturg, but I employ those same three things: observation, analysis, and response. And what I say is I'm dramaturging their strategic plan, their organization, little structure, and all of the other things that happen among an institution that is a not-for-profit, that has staff members, that has a board of directors. And I look at all that and I do the same thing I do with any new play. I see, okay, how does this make me feel about you, about what I'm seeing? How am I analyzing? How do I interpret what I'm observing? And ultimately, how do I report out? What is my response, and how do I communicate back to the people who've asked me for my thoughts exactly what I feel could be improved, but what I feel is working really well already? And that's something that is always a balance to be struck when working as a dramaturg. I often will say dramaturgs have to be a little diplomatic in that way, and especially if you are holding multiple spaces at once, right? If you're working for an institution, but you're also engaged as a freelance dramaturg for a project being housed at that institution, there's a couple of different nuances that have to be employed when navigating those situations that also really take a lot of diplomacy and understanding of the creative process, being as individual as the people who engage in it.
You talked about being a new play dramaturg, and you also talked about, working with playwrights when their play is just newly on the page. Can you talk about how your role shifts from workshop into a production, or what it looks like in that workshop space and then moving into production?
Absolutely. Yeah. I find that a lot more decisions have to be made, right? When you're moving to production, there are timelines and budgets and far more creative team members that are engaged in that process than there would be in, say, a workshop or new play development process. You may have a director, a dramaturg, and some actors in the workshop process, but when you move into production, you now have designers and technicians who are all on different time schedules and production schedules and budget lines. Things must move a little more quickly in the production process than in the workshop process. And so what I find my role shifts to is not losing sight of those original conversations, the ones that did take a long time to work through in the workshop phase. The ways we came to decisions in that moment had been hopefully well documented by the dramaturg, so that when production schedules get a little tight and things feel like, oh, we're moving away from this vision that was so clear in the workshop, the dramaturg can come in and go, I see where we are moving away. It is because of X, Y, and Z stipulations to this production. Does this feel germane to the story? And start asking those questions, not just of the writer, but of the entire team. This adjustment in the lighting, what does it do to the moment? To the moment that is being crafted on stage as prescribed by the vision of the playwright? Is it being honored by the choices the designer's making? Is it being honored by the pieces that are being built by the shops? Are the words changing because of a set piece? Does that happen? Are there things in the production budget that are now making adjustments in the text because certain elements could not be afforded by that company? Does that feel right? Does that feel good? If not, what are some creative solutions that we all can employ to start really honing in on how to honor a vision that was determined before those technicians got there, and really carry them along? Again, I think the dramaturg is ultimately a bridge builder, from the text and the vision of the original generative artists to the tech, to the technical artists, and to the building of the physical world on stage, and then to the audience, because the audience will be the one who knows the least about how those decisions got made, about why certain artistic choices were employed in this one moment. But the dramaturg is also the one who often will do a talk back, or create a lobby display, or a program note, or do an interview with some of the creative team members, asking those important questions, so that the questions that the audience walks out with will ultimately be answered by the time they get back to their homes, because they will have had it contextualized for them in a way that feels appropriate and doesn't really deter from the choices made by the creative team, but in fact amplifies them.
Can I ask a follow-up question that might be, I don't know, this might be a challenging one. You talked about being a kind of a bridge builder. And as you were talking about the play and how the different elements feed in, I'm wondering if you ever have a moment where you feel like, especially if the playwright is involved in the production, that there's tension between the playwright's vision and the director's vision and what your role is there. And if you have to have a loyalty, where your loyalty lies.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, that is a common occurrence, and not necessarily just by those two disciplines, but sometimes by the institution's agenda and the agenda of the artistic team themselves. But I will use your example and run with that. But yes, I found, again, this idea of dramaturg as diplomat comes in a lot in these types of high stakes. I would call them high stakes situations, especially if a production is slated for a specific timeline and the tensions are holding us back in terms of how much is getting accomplished every day in rehearsal. Those are things that sort of up the stress levels of a lot of processes. And so what I like to do in those situations is have some time away and start to pull the creative team back so that it doesn't feel like we're always in it all the time. But again, to go back to say like, hey, let's talk about some earlier conversations we had before these tensions arose and talk about where we were in alignment. Where did our alignment digress at any point? Like at one point, did we feel like we were not talking the same language or looking at the same page even of how we want to move this forward? And in terms of loyalty, for me, it's the process. It's the process itself. It's not necessarily to one or another artist. And I find that once I start honoring a process and not a person, the other collaborators start to really hone in on the agenda of the group, the collective consciousness, the way we all want to move forward together. Because ultimately, I do believe that most responsible, generous artists are not there to be combative. They're there to be collaborative, and they're not competitors. They're all working in the same team. And if we can create that teamwork mentality, or the idea that we are all after actually a similar goal, we all have a shared vision, I think that is the role of the dramaturg as diplomat, is to remind us of what vision is shared and what we all sort of collectively agreed to in the beginning to move forward with. And so if anything has shifted, ultimately the dramaturg would be the one with those notes, the notes from those early conversations, or the notes from private individual consultations where if playwright may have expressed a vulnerability that wasn't shared with the director, and so sensitivity is not being applied to that moment. And so the dramaturg then is the one to carry that vulnerability and to communicate sensitivity and to really model a behavior for the room as a collaborator, as a professional collaborator. And that's something that comes with varying degrees of success. I will also say dramaturgs are not therapists. They are not the ones. They are also not social workers. They are not the ones who are meant to be the mediators of combative or aggressive artists. If anything, they are mediating conversations that are artistically charged and feel like they are moving forward a process that feels good for everybody and not just for the director and the writer. Because ultimately, yeah, I've offered research to set designers and costume designers, and I feel like I'm their dramaturg too when I'm in a production. And when I was a literary manager for an institution, even if I wasn't a dramaturg on a project, I would say, hey, what do you want that lobby to look like? Does it feel like we have done enough to really build that bridge to the audience and your work? Let's talk about, and if not, let's talk about that. And I feel like, yeah, if a dramaturg can be anything, it's the one that talks. It's the one that keeps talking and doesn't shy away from hard conversations or conversations that feel uncomfortable. If anything, they create a space to have those respectfully and civilly.
I feel like you should write a book, Lynde. Not a book. I want it to be a graphic novel, because I see a lot of pictures as you talk, and you come up with really great names. Like I'm thinking like Thought Partnership and like Bridge Builder and things. I just think that you should work on a dramaturgy book that is a graphic novel.
I love that idea. Thank you.
I think you should just quit and just work on that right now. Like we can end it and then you just start work.
I will.
Well, you talked about the different, like what all dramaturgs pretty much have in common, talking about from observation to response and that process. Are there any other things that you think that top tier And whatever that means to you is like the best dramaturgs have in common.
I find that the best dramaturgs are often really good listeners. They often aren't the ones who project their opinions, but rather receive understanding of other people's opinions or perspectives on things. They're good questioners. They love to ask questions. They're very inquisitive. And I find that curiosity, folks that are continuously curious about not just the things that they don't know, but the things that are like, well, I thought I knew this. Am I right? Am I wrong? Like, what did you want me to think in this moment? I find that they are also good communicators. They're able to articulate the things that are uncomfortable, but also are really exciting. And they're able to start to identify the elements that make them so, right? Like this idea of analysis and response to me are about articulating expressions that may be complex, but you are communicating them in a very simple way, not to be reductive, but so that it is understood by more people, as opposed to having sort of what I call like an insider language. Theater is full of this like coded language, and very often it feels exclusionary to folks who are new to the field, but also folks who are maybe transitioning from a different industry. And I think that the more we expand our perspectives and understand that the language we use to talk about what we do must be ever evolving, I think that is also fluidity and adaptability, being able to change the way you talk about a specific piece of work based on how your knowledge of the field, the industry, culture, society, human condition evolves. I find that the best dramaturgs I know never really stop learning. And they're always like the constant student. People have often asked me when they see me show up in different training rooms, I often will take on facilitator trainings or mediator trainings for talkbacks, or even when a new software comes out, like Canva came out and everyone wanted to make digital lobby displays and everyone was like all excited about like moving to this digital world of dramaturgy. I showed up in every single course and people were like, Lynde, you have a graduate degree. Lynde, you've been working in this field a long time. And I'm like, the only way to stay fit is to keep training. You know, this idea that you would ever sort of like check the box of education and say like, nope, that's it. It really stifles you as the field evolves, as art making and theater making changes and shifts over time. It's important, again, to use the metaphor of medicine, to sort of recertify yourself every couple of years and really start to look at how practices have changed, how expectations have changed over time. There was an expectation for dramaturgs to be critics for a long time. And it wasn't until a real shift in this idea of what open collaboration looks like, what devising processes look like with different disciplines. All of these smaller movements contributed to a larger shift. And I find that the best dramaturgs are adaptable to those shifts, and they start to move with them and learn about how to understand and apply those new techniques, new practices. I mean, LMDA, Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas, holds an annual conference every year, much like most other industries, because they want to start talking to each other about what is happening on the West Coast that's not happening on the East Coast, what's happening in the South that's not happening in the North, and what is the Midwest doing really right that the coasts could really learn from. And those are the things that feel like dramaturgs are uniquely suited to see those patterns because of how expansive our field is. Those conferences of dramaturgs, freelancers come together with academics who come together with literary managers, and in a way we all sort of diffuse those hierarchies so that we can learn from each other and start to do real skill sharing and talk about the things that feel too hard for any one person to tackle, and to really start relying on our collective and our community of dramaturgs to come through to resolve or rectify or reconcile how we are moving forward as a field.
I feel like you sort of answered this next question in many ways, which is, you know, what advice do you have for new dramaturgs? And I hear you saying, you know, constant learning and curiosity and recertification, as you said. Are there other, you talked about the Literary Managers Association and Dramaturg Association, LMDA. Are there other resources or professional development opportunities or practices that you would recommend for a dramaturg or, at any stage to keep growing and becoming, a richer and deeper dramaturg?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. I have sort of said a lot of the high points of it: adaptability, curiosity. I would also say just something that I have personally found very helpful to me. A mentor years ago would say this to me all the time: is don't show up thinking you know what's going to happen. Don't show up to your first page of a new play thinking you know what's going to happen. Don't show up to the first day of rehearsal thinking you know what's going to happen. If anything, show up with the idea of, oh, I wonder what's going to happen today.
Mm-hmm.
And this level of openness to adjustments or curiosities or things that come up creates a model, again, for collaboration to feel less rigid and a lot more expansive and fluid, to just really be open to a question that may come your way during the table work of a new play or even a classic play, and recognize that, again, dramaturgs are not the experts on all things to all people all the time. And so I find advice, especially for early career dramaturgs who feel like they have to get it right or say the right thing or have the right answer to every question as it is asked. I have often in my professional long-term career have said, I don't know. I can find out and come back to you with an answer. Or, I'm actually not the right person to answer that question. I'm going to find a resource to connect you with that's not me as a person, but may actually be very helpful to your process right now. And I think another piece of advice is, look for the things that you feel are missing for you, right? Like if you feel like, oh, I've had so much time studying Shakespeare, but I haven't had a lot of time reading new plays by living playwrights. That is an area where it can be improved. And the New Play Exchange is a database, if you haven't heard of it, of new plays that if you want to subscribe, I think it's like $10 a year, some very low cost amount. I spent most of my pandemic reading new works from playwrights who actually I had never known or met. They were just brand new to me. And very often, I will be engaged in a process that feels very challenging because it's not my area of expertise. And I say don't shy away from those challenges. Don't feel like, oh, I know I'm not the right person. Start your engagement process with it. And you feel like if you need to connect to outside resources, absolutely. Don't feel that you are any less of the dramaturg for that piece because you are not every resource to every person every minute, but that you can really reach outside. Yeah, get as many certifications, take as many classes, take different classes. Like I said, at Hofstra, the only way I knew dramaturgy was for me was because all of the other classes were not. And it was this lovely process of elimination where I was like, okay, I think I'm honing in on where I fit in this larger world. And so if you find that you're not fitting in one type of dramaturgy, there may be many others that you just haven't explored yet. And so for anyone who's early to that career, please don't limit yourself. I would say that as my advice.
Thank you. Well, I think Alayna's going to take us to submitted questions, and I would like to invite the folks who are joining us live, if you have questions, to put them in the chat now.
So we had a submitted question that is very specific. Will a Bachelor of Arts in Digital Film with an emphasis on screenwriting be sufficient to become a dramaturg? If not, what other degrees should they pursue or get to further their career in dramaturgy?
I would say that it doesn't disqualify you from becoming a dramaturg if a Bachelor of Arts in Digital Film with an emphasis on screenwriting is what you have under your belt already. That's totally okay. But I would say that sufficient to become a dramaturg is a phrase that, again, it feels a little limiting. I feel like I, as a dramaturg who have been practicing for over 2 decades in this at this point, it really does feel like there is nothing I could do to be as sufficient in my practice as to just continue practicing. I will say there are degree programs that give you a degree in dramaturgy. The one that I participated in does not exist anymore. So the American Repertory Theater, Moscow Art Theater Institute for Advanced Theater Training at Harvard University is on interminable hiatus at the moment. It's also the longest title for a graduate program ever. But there are incredible new programs that are specific to dramaturgy, both undergrad and graduate. level. And to pursue a career in dramaturgy, I find that the skills that you employ are often more, again, this is a new shift where before institutions and other freelance artists were only looking for accreditations or educational certificates and degrees, whereas now I find the experiential field work that you engage in is much more compelling to bring you into the world of dramaturgy. And so, for example, if you never had a degree in theater, but you've been working with playwrights a really long time, a new playwright is more apt to trust you and your instincts and your impressions than say someone who feels a little more novice or hasn't dipped their toe in the new play world. And the same thing, if you're a theater historian and someone is working on a history play, they may engage you as a dramaturg, even though that is not necessarily how you identify, because you have the skills that they need to help support their work. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I think I have one last question, which is really around the fact that I haven't traditionally seen dramaturgs expected in every single room, in a workshop room necessarily, but even more often in like a new play production setting. There's a wonderment in me if folks know how to enlist a dramaturg in the room, and if they understand the value and how to create space for them. So what response might you have to a situation like that, where someone's like, I don't really know how we would invite a dramaturg into this space or how we would create a role for them?
Absolutely. There are a number of sort of hard resources that I can guide you to. The Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas houses a lot of these resources on their website, lmda.org. The one that comes to mind is around sample contracts. So the same way any artistic team member is brought into or enlisted into a project is through a contract. And the contract is sort of a list of expectations, both on the part of the person employing and the part of the employee, to know what are they walking into. And I find that specifically, if you are looking for, say, someone who specializes in musicals or someone who specializes in multilingual works of art and things like that, or is into history or Shakespeare and new works, you can start to search for dramaturgs based on their skill and expertise on a number of different sites, not just the LMDA website, but the New Play Exchange has started housing freelance dramaturgs who are in their profiles, note what their level of skill is and their expertise areas as well. I would say that there are a number of Facebook groups, right? Social media is really exciting for some of these ways in which we can, across regions and across geographies, sort of come together to put out a call. Hey, I'm looking for this type of person. Hey, I'm doing this project and I need somebody. And it's sort of a quick way to get to know a lot of people. And I find that if you don't really already have instilled this idea of, oh, every production needs a dramaturg, every process needs this outside set of eyes or this professional collaborator to be engaged, it is often on the artists themselves to say, you know what, I have this person who's a real trusted collaborator of mine. I really want them in the room for this new work that I'm doing. And it's not just the playwrights. I have worked with many directors who are like, you know what, your insights are so different than mine. I really need that separate perspective in the room. I know you don't know this playwright, but let me introduce you and let's see if we can really make a match here and start to do a lot of that hard work of building trust as a creative team together. Like dramaturg as diplomat, sometimes it's dramaturg as Yenta as well, which is the matchmaker for any of you musical theater fans who know Fiddler. Yeah, dramaturg as matchmaker is exciting because, again, if you're not the right one or if you feel like someone's missing, you can go find them and sort of make that match together and feel like you have aided the production or the process as it has called for it, not necessarily how you have prescribed it.
That's beautiful. Well, I've got one last question from a participant, and then we will wrap up. So the question is, do you have any tools for diagnostics that you use? Do you have a template or a process when you approach a new play? For example, do you do a character analysis for each character? Do you follow the plot line to see that it works?
Yeah, I think absolutely all of those things are appropriate to the diagnostics of a new play. I would also say, for example, you just mentioned character analysis. If I see in the character description that these two characters are listed as brother and sister, and yet when I read the play, they come across as lovers, that's something that's to be mentioned in my consultation with this playwright. In the same way that if I'm following a plot in rural Missouri and all of a sudden we're in space, I will go, oh, how did we get to space? That's new and I wasn't expecting it. And so there are sort of, I guess, organic responses or natural responses I will have. Again, as an audience member, if I'm seeing something that doesn't make sense to me, I will just note that. And I will ask a question about why is this here in this moment when these two characters are saying these things to each other? How would you like me to feel about that? Because how I do feel when I read it is like this. And ultimately it is about feeling. And a lot of it is about intuition of, oh, I think I made a big intuitive leap that you didn't guide me to. So where do you want my brain to go when you take me here? And those types of language tools, which again are always formed as questions, not necessarily like, I don't understand this. Please tell me how you understand this, so that I can have an understanding of your intention. And then we can talk through what is the best way to execute that intention. And what are the ways and the tools that I can give you. For example, can I give you some recommendations of plays that may have these same issues that have resolved them in these ways, so that I can share some examples with you. I will also sort of talk through structure. If I feel like actually the episodic structure of this is really confusing, perhaps if you try a linear structure, the plot points will fall differently for you. I always encourage experimentation and to start pulling things apart and putting them back together. It's very helpful for some writers to just sort of break out of this is how you write a play form. Because again, there's no right way to be a dramaturg. There's no right way to be a playwright. You do it as you individually feel called to it. And I find that the more I understand why you're called and what you're calling in with your work, the better I will be at helping support the continuation of that work.
Thank you so much, Lynde. Thank you for the questions, for those of you who joined us today. So I want to lift up the fact that we also have a dramaturgy program for our members at the Playwright Center. And so for folks who have written a play and want this kind of deep observational analysis response kind of feedback on their plays, I encourage you to reach out and look at our dramaturgy page. And we'd love to connect you with folks who, like Lynde, focus on new work and want to help you write the play that you want to write.
Yeah. Our next episode will be a closed recording, but we are still taking questions for people in that session. This session is focusing on, do I need an agent and how do I get one? In this episode of Theater Begins Here, we are going to be speaking with Alexis Williams to help demystify the road to getting an agent and whether having one makes or breaks your career. Although, again, this is not a live session, we are still responding to the questions. So if you go to our website, you can click on that link and submit. We will be recording on December 5th. And this episode is really for people who are interested in getting an agent, are wondering if they even need one, what to know, how you might even become an agent. And then you can also just get to know Alexis and her journey and experiences being an agent and an associate artistic director.
So we always like to close these with talking about where theater begins for us. Our podcast is called Theater Begins Here. So we end with theater begins blank. So we want to invite you to tell us, Lynde, where theater begins for you. You're welcome to go first, or Alayna and I can start and you can close us out.
No, I've thought about it a little bit, okay. having listened to previous episodes, because now I'm a fan of the podcast. And for me, I really believe theater begins when it is shared. I really believe it as a shared experience. And if it's not, it doesn't feel like theater.
I love that. Alayna, do you want to go next?
Okay, I have 3.5 Post-its because you said a bunch of things. And so I'm trying to formulate it, but I think I have it. So bear with me. This is a longer answer than what I thought was going to happen. But then the graphic novel that Lynde is writing just slipped over my head. So for me today, theater begins with thought partnership that has fluid and responsive support that is focused on intentionality. And that intentionality is like the drive.
Alayna, I love this. You've like synthesized all this whole conversation into one. I feel like I should just leave it at that.
I kind of wish that there were pictures as I said it, but I'm curious about this graphic novel.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation so much. And I think for me today, theater begins, as you two are saying, when you're ready to open your work up to collaboration, to making it bigger than just with yourself.
Yeah, that vulnerability factor. That's
yeah. What a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much, Lynde, for joining us. Thank you, folks who joined us live. We look forward to sharing this episode with you again on our podcast website, on the Playwright Center website, and also you can hear it on Spotify. And we wish everybody a lovely rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.